All right. So hi, this is Matt Oland. I'm talking about forming and managing student teams. So CATME has a team maker feature, which is designed to form teams according to instructor-specified criteria. There's a bit of research on forming teams, but there's also a lot of unanswered questions related to how teams are formed and the final composition that you end up with. The research does include evidence that if students are in a minoritized group, in engineering, women, racial minorities, if they're outnumbered on a team, their teammates will interrupt them, they will not listen to their input, and so in other ways they can be silenced or made to feel like they shouldn't contribute. And so one of the features of that, the team maker, is that it will attempt to not outnumber people who are in an unidentified group like that. There's quite a bit of research that indicates that self-selected teams, so allowing students to pick their own teams, has a variety of consequences, including teams that have social cohesion, but they don't develop task cohesion, including teams that discover that just because someone is a friend, you don't necessarily work together well with them in the context of a class. And in particular, those teams tend to have very little diversity of any kind, because if people don't have enough information, they tend to form teams of people who they think they would work well with, which means generally people who look like them, in both physically and sort of mentally, right, cognitively. When you're forming teams, there are a variety of additional criteria we do know about. If the focus is on learning, it is good to form teams of mixed ability, and the system uses the feature group dissimilar. But there are circumstances where some people form teams that have to compete for a grade with other teams, and there the focus is on performance, and it's not fair necessarily to put teams together of mixed ability in that circumstance. If teams will work outside of class rather than just ad hoc in-class experience, then it is certainly appropriate to consider schedule, and the system will do that. And there, the feature, of course, is group similar. It actually doesn't allow you to intentionally group students who have dissimilar schedules. We have a newer feature, which is preference ranking, which helps assign students to teams, but also simultaneously teams to projects. So that's very useful for capstone and things like that. And we do have evidence, a publication that shows that the algorithm for forming teams, which I can discuss further with anyone who's interested, does allow for both meeting the criteria from an instructor better, but also more consistently than could be done by an experienced faculty member using the same criteria. So once teams are formed, it's important to be able to understand what's happening, especially when those teams are functioning outside of the view of an instructor. And peer evaluation is a very effective way of doing that. There's lots of research on peer evaluation generally. In this context, the system has a behaviorally anchored rating scale, which I'll discuss. So when using peer evaluation, it's definitely important for students to know how they will be evaluated. In the case of CATME, these 5 dimensions are the ones that are used. Contributing to the work of the team is essentially an effort measure, but effort of sufficient quality that it doesn't need to be redone. Interacting with teammates includes respecting your teammates, engaging them, providing feedback to them. Keeping the team on track is about monitoring conditions that affect the team and making sure that it's making progress toward its goals. Having relevant knowledge, skills, and abilities is about, again, relevant to the work of the team. So basically having enough knowledge and skills to be able to contribute. And expecting quality is about both believing and voicing the belief that the team can do a good job, but also expecting it to do a good job. So a student who can say, this work is not good enough for our team. That's someone who's doing well on expecting quality. So that's an educational process right there. Further, an educational process is that any skill that is being developed requires practice to improve. And so the CATME system has built into it a rate or practice feature that gives students practice rating on a situation that doesn't require social pressure, because they're evaluating a person who doesn't actually exist based on a verbal description of how that student is behaving. And they get feedback dimension by dimension on how well they're using the instrument. So that's how that system works. And we actually gamify that where students get feedback with their high score on the practice and the team's high score. So some students will play it repeatedly, trying to improve their score. Another way, once the team is actually operating as a team, they get feedback from the behavioral anchors on the behaviorally anchored scale. They do not see numbers. So the interpretation of the feedback you see before you and the scale has been truncated. So it only shows the middle level at the bottom of the screen, and a student who is operating above expectations would show the behaviors that are at the top of the instrument there. And it reminds the student how they rated themselves in the first column. It tells them the average, the sense of the average of the team's rating of how they behaved on this dimension. And then finally, to put that in context, it shows what the average rating within the team is, so that a student can learn if their team is just simply inflating all the ratings. In this case, the message is the team is not inflating their ratings. The average in the team is in the middle of the scale, and this student actually is behaving in this dimension is behaving above expectations. Another way that students get feedback in the system is through comments. It is possible to collect these and not release them to the students. It's also possible to collect them anonymously. Obviously, these have been anonymized because these were actual comments that were made. Reading across a row in this table gives you 4 people's perspectives on the behavior of student number 1. And reading down a column, such as the first column, gives you student 1's comments on each member of the team, which in this case, it allows you to note that student 1 is very task work focused in their comments, whereas students 2, 3, and 4 are more focused on teamwork behaviors. And again, as you read across, you can get multiple perspectives on how a particular student is engaging with the team. We provide the opportunity to release those directly to the students because research does show that students are more motivated by feedback from a peer than feedback from an authority figure, such as an instructor. So ideally, students will use that information to self-manage, and then an instructor only needs to step in if that's not happening. So let's talk about how an instructor might intervene. So the instructor view of this system does use numbers because numbers are easier to do math on. In this case, I've actually got I've contrived a case where all of the possible exceptional conditions will be shown. So this is not normally what you would see in a class with this much color. But those conditions off on the right highlight in sort of traffic light coloring which conditions require the most attention. A manipulator is someone who appears to be saying that they did all the work in their team, which they might think that you're an instructor who doesn't pay any attention whatsoever and just gives them a higher grade. A click indicates the team has divided into 2 teams. An over, which stands for overconfident, is a student who their self-rating, it indicates that they are behaving better than their teammates say they are behaving, which might represent a number of different challenging conditions. A conflict indicates a person who has rated a particular teammate differently, or well, worse, than other teammates have rated them. Again, a situation that would require more exploration. Most of these, especially the most severe conditions, we normally advocate for observing the team live to be able to tell what's really going on. That has become much more challenging in a virtual space, but it is still possible to have someone visit a breakout room and to get a sense of the dynamic of a team. On the screen there, you also see that there is an adjustment factor. That's what the ADJ factor is. That is strictly the student's average rating on the different dimensions divided by the team's average rating on the dimensions. As shown, it actually has some caps on it, so it doesn't get too high, but you can also get the raw calculation if you want it. We recommend, and in first year engineering, we do use it as a diagnostic tool, so we do not use those factors in our grading, but some people do use those factors in their grading, partly because it's an easy number to get at. And because we know that some people use those, you can see that some of those are shaded. That's an indication that those exceptional conditions have made those numbers are questionable, more than usual, right? Along with all of these exceptional conditions, a non-judgmental automated message can be released to the students. So it doesn't use any of these terms like overconfident, because we don't know exactly that that's what's happening. That message would tell a student, your self-rating was higher than the average rating from your teammates, and we might need more information to know what's happening. So the description of the condition is very objective. Since we prefer to use this system in a diagnostic way, we actually have a flow chart for the what do we do, and I'll highlight a portion of that flow chart. But the important things to note are the very first question is there time for the situation to be fixed? Because our preference is always that the student or the team figure out how to function correctly, and then the situation is rectified, and no further adjustment needs to be taken. Ultimately, sometimes you do unfortunately receive information about a dysfunction when it's too late to fix it. If that's the case, then the important question is whether the student or the team received feedback in time to do anything about it. And hopefully that was the case, that they did receive feedback in an appropriate timescale. And then if they fail to act on it, then it's appropriate to talk about grade adjustments. If they didn't have time if there is no time to correct it, and no one gave them feedback about it sooner, then the more difficult thing is confirming that in fact it happened, right? Confirming that there was a dysfunctional behavior. If the student doesn't acknowledge it, unfortunately, we're in trouble unless we have independent data that confirms that that was a problem. Commonly, we do get independent data, which is a student, for example, will say, well, no, I didn't engage with my team because they shut me out in some way. And while that's a problem with the whole team, it's also a problem that the student didn't tell us that they weren't working on a project, right? So there's still room for action there, and we need to think about what happened in the whole team as well. Ultimately, if a team is hoping to get extra credit because one of their team members was not engaging fully, we never award that credit unless they did the work of trying to engage that team member and giving them feedback. If they were silent about it, then they were accepting essentially of the student's poor behavior, and they don't get any reward for that because they failed to give us and the student an opportunity to fix that behavior. And that's not being a good teammate either. And so that part of the process is highlighted here. Again, we wouldn't use the adjustment factor to make that adjustment. We would prefer, for example, if a student failed to participate in certain milestones, they would lose credit on those milestones, but not necessarily the others. And if they were generally lackluster throughout a project, we would try to estimate the percentage by which they were disengaged. And the only other thing I wanted to share here is that we do have a variety of patterns of poor rating behavior that we see. And the system actually does highlight these for when people review feedback from their teams. The most common is probably the top one. And we have had this discussion in my classes before, which is to say to students, okay, so some of you have said that everyone on your team is perfect in every way. And in reality, that seems unlikely. And so the discussion at the top there is a very valuable discussion. When students are asked, why would a student rate that way, right? What could that mean? The students are very honest about the fact that maybe they were running out of time, maybe they were trying to tell you to leave their team alone, maybe they were trying to tell you they're not comfortable evaluating other people, and so forth. And again, they're honest when asked what the consequences of doing that are, which is consequences such as the team doesn't get feedback to improve, the individual doesn't get feedback to improve. And so following that simple exercise, rating behavior does improve. We have evidence of that. So even just discussing the very first set of rating patterns there. So our work is sponsored by the National Science Foundation, but I do want to talk about just a few logistics related to peer evaluation that help improve the results from peer evaluation as well. So the first is it should count somehow that students engage in it. So in other words, that giving feedback is a priority and that participating is worth some credit. We have taken some level of minimum expectation as the middle of the scale to be expected and have taken credit from students who perform below that on average. But again, accounting for the possibility of any rating bias to avoid penalizing students inappropriately. We also expect that if comments are expected, that they should also have a graded component to ensure that students know that that's valued. And then the biggest thing that instructors can do to make sure that students know that this is valued is to let them know how you're using the data. And research is very open on the various ways that you can indicate using the data. So it can be used to adjust grades. It can be used for faculty to intervene. It can be used to collect reflections from students on how they're performing in their team. So any of a variety of ways of using the data can meet that need for students to know that it's important for the data to be in there, just to make sure that students do know that. Any peer evaluation is more accurate if administered after an important deliverable. It makes it it raises the stakes of the evaluation. And then ultimately, as I said before, it's very important to supplement peer evaluations with observations when possible, so that you don't just take students' words for what might be happening, which can introduce certain kinds of biases, especially racism, sexism, xenophobia, things like that. But your observations can help identify when those things are happening and to account for them as you interpret the results. And so let me give credit where credit is due. Grants from the National Science Foundation, early support from the ERM division for the TeamMaker component, as well as from Rose-Hulman, where that was first designed. And we had a professional developer who kicked us off on this that I'd like to credit as well. So thanks very much.